Marcus Delgado took the house, the cars, and every joint account in the divorce, and told his lawyer there was nothing else worth fighting over. He forgot the 4 acres in his wife's maiden name. He should not have forgotten it. Carol Whitfield was 43 years old when the marriage ended, and for 19 years before that, she had been the one who kept the Delgado feed and hardware running on Route 9 outside Merrill, Nebraska, while Marcus stood in front of customers and took the credit. She had done the books since she was 24, the year they married, balancing the ledger by hand for the first 6 years because Marcus had never trusted the software people with his numbers. Then moving the whole operation onto a proper accounting system in 2011 over a weekend by herself while Marcus was at a supplier conference she later learned had been nothing of the sort. She had built the inventory system the supplier reps still asked about by name. The Whitfield system. 2 of them called it without knowing why, not realizing the name was already half right. She knew to the dollar what fertilizer cost in March versus what it cost in June, and she had never once needed a calculator to figure margin on a load of lumber standing in the yard with a customer waiting. Her hands were the hands of someone who had spent 2 decades stacking 80-pound feed bags and running a hand truck loaded with seed corn through gravel in February, breath fogging in front of her face. She could close a deal in that same gravel a lot faster than Marcus could, and had done it more times than he ever knew, because he was usually inside on the phone when it happened. She had grown up 4 miles outside town on a parcel of land her grandfather, Earl Whitfield, had farmed until his hands gave out in 1991. The arthritis finally winning an argument it had been having with him since the Carter administration. Earl had never sold the land. He left it to Carol outright in his will, 4 acres held separately from anything she would later bring into a marriage, because Earl Whitfield did not trust son-in-laws, present or future, and had said so at his own kitchen table the year before he died, with Carol's mother standing at the stove, pretending not to listen. Earl had farmed corn and soybeans on the back 2 acres for most of his working life, run a handful of hogs on the front half-acre in the years before that became impractical, and kept the equipment shed stocked with tools he maintained as carefully as he maintained the land itself. A habit Carol had absorbed simply by being present for it, summers and weekends, from the time she was old enough to carry a tool without dropping it. The land had sat untouched since 1991, 4 acres of scrub grass and a collapsed equipment shed, the kind of parcel a county assessor lists at $1,400 and forgets about for a decade at a time. Marcus had seen it exactly twice in 19 years of marriage. Both times he had called it Carol's junk lot and asked, not entirely joking, when she was going to let the county take it for back taxes and save them the mowing. The marriage had lasted 19 years. Carol had been 24 when she married Marcus Delgado in the basement of First Lutheran on a Saturday in October, and 43 when she signed the papers that ended it. She remembered both numbers the way she remembered every number that mattered to her, which was most of them. She did not have children, a fact Marcus had brought up exactly once, 4 years into the marriage, in a tone she had filed away and never forgotten, as though her usefulness were a category with subcategories, and she had quietly failed one of them. Marcus Delgado was 46 when he filed, a heavyset man with an easy laugh that customers liked and employees learned, eventually, not to trust. He had run Delgado Feed and Hardware for 22 years, inheriting the original building from his own father. And he told anyone who asked that he had built the business from the ground up, a phrase that had always made Carol go quietly still behind the register, because she had been the one doing the actual ground-up work since the year she turned 24. By the time he filed for divorce, he had already moved a woman named Renee Hutchins into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln, 91 minutes from Merrill, by the interstate. He had been seeing her for 14 months, which Carol had known for 11 of them, because Marcus was a careless liar in the specific way of men who have never had to be good at it. Don Caswell, the lawyer whose office sat above the Merrow County Bank, had been practicing family and probate law in the county for 26 years and had a reputation, locally, for moving fast and settling cheap on behalf of whichever party hired him first. He billed Marcus $275 an hour, and it spent, by Carol's later count from the filing's own cost summary, just under 4 hours total reviewing the entirety of the marital and non-marital property before recommending the settlement terms. Not enough time. Phil Anders would tell her later, almost apologetically, to have done more than glance at a county assessor's printout for the 4 acres and accept its number at face value. "I want a clean split," Marcus told her on a Tuesday in February, standing in the kitchen on Birchwood Lane where she had cooked 19 years of dinners. A kitchen with a backsplash she had picked out herself in 2009 because Marcus had no opinion about backsplashes or anything else in that house that did not involve a television. Fast and fair. I already talked to Don about it. Don Caswell was Marcus's lawyer, a man with an office above the bank who handled most of the county's contested wills and exactly the kind of divorce Marcus wanted. Quick, clean on paper, and entirely in his favor underneath the paper. The settlement proposal Don Caswell drafted gave Marcus the house on Birchwood Lane, both vehicles, the F-250 and the Tahoe, the joint checking and savings accounts totaling $61,400, and full ownership of Delgado Feed and Hardware, the business Carol had run day to day for 19 years while Marcus ran his mouth. In exchange, Carol kept her grandfather's land, the 4 acres that Don Caswell's filing described, almost as an afterthought, in a single clause near the bottom of page 3. As negligible non-marital real property, undeveloped, estimated value under $2,000. "You get to keep your little farm," Marcus said, the day he handed her the folder, his voice doing the thing it always did when he believed he had already won an argument no one else knew they were having. "I'm not trying to be cruel here, Carol. I'm being practical. Somebody has to be the adult about the assets, and you were never going to want to run the store without me anyway." That last part was the part that stayed with her longest, longer even than the number on the settlement page. Marcus had said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather, with no apparent awareness that he was describing 19 years of his own absence and calling it her limitation. He had not run the inventory system since 2011, when Carol rebuilt it from a notebook ledger into something the supplier reps started calling, without irony, the Whitfield system, a name 2 of them used for years without realizing how literally accurate it already was. He had not negotiated a wholesale account in longer than that. What Marcus actually did, 6 days a week, was stand at the front counter being likable, taking credit for deliveries Carol had scheduled, margins Carol had calculated, and relationships Carol had built one slow Tuesday afternoon at a time across 19 years of a marriage he was now describing as a service he had performed for her. He had set the manila folder down on the kitchen table, the same table where Carol had eaten breakfast for 19 years, the one with the water stain near the leg that neither of them had ever bothered to sand out, and slid it toward her the way you'd slide a check across a counter. "Don already drew it up clean," Marcus said. "House, vehicles, the accounts, the store. You keep the land out by your grandpa's old place. Seemed fair to me, given everything." "Given what, exactly?" Carol said. "Given that you never really wanted to run a business, Carol, you wanted to help me run one." "There's a difference." He said it lightly, the way he said most things that were going to cost her something, as if the saying of it cost him nothing either. She had looked at him for a long moment across the table with the water stain neither of them had sanded out. and had thought, not for the first time, that the cruelest part of 19 years was not any single thing Marcus had done. It was that he had never once, in all that time, been curious enough about her to learn what she actually wanted, and had therefore never once been wrong about it by accident. Only by a kind of incuriosity so total it functioned exactly like cruelty, without ever needing to mean it. She did not argue with him in the kitchen. She had learned, over 19 years, exactly when arguing with Marcus cost more than it returned. She had learned it the hard way 3 or 4 times early in the marriage, and had simply stopped paying that particular tuition. The first time over a truck he'd bought without telling her. The second over a vacation he'd canceled to take Renee's predecessor, a woman named Sherry, to a hunting lodge in Colorado he told Carol was a supplier conference. She signed the settlement 6 weeks later in a conference room above a title company on Main Street with her own lawyer, a tired, decent man named Phil Anders, who had handled half the contested divorces in Merrill County over the past 2 decades. Sitting across from her, with the papers spread out, and a look on his face that suggested he had read the filing more carefully than Carol had let on that she had. "You could fight for more of the business," Phil said. 19 years of unpaid labor is worth something in front of a judge, Carol. You built the supplier relationships. You built the inventory system. There's a reasonable argument that store doesn't run without you, and a judge who's seen 10 of these knows it too. "I don't want the store," Carol said. "I never wanted the store. I wanted him to see me running it." "That's a different thing entirely, Phil, and I don't expect you to put that in a filing." Phil Anders looked at her for a long moment and did not ask what she meant. He had been doing this work long enough to recognize when a client had already made a decision that had nothing to do with the law. What Carol did not say in that conference room, because she had decided a long time ago that some things you do not hand to a lawyer who bills by the hour, was that she had spent 4 Saturdays the previous autumn driving out to her grandfather's land with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair, walking the property line end to end, and talking to a man named Russ Okafor, who ran a small environmental and mineral survey outfit out of Kearney, and who owed her a favor from 2 winters back, when she had given his daughter a summer job stocking shelves at a time the family badly needed the income. Russ had pulled some old county records for her, the kind of records anyone could request from the courthouse for the price of a copy fee, and mentioned, over coffee at her kitchen table, almost in passing, that the parcel sat nearly square on top of the eastern edge of the Larrabee sand and gravel deposit, a formation the county had surveyed for road material rights back in 1974 and then forgotten about entirely when the original mining outfit folded during the farm crisis of the early 80s. Russ had said it the way you'd mentioned the weather. "Somebody's going to want that someday, Carol. Sand and gravel's not glamorous, but it doesn't go out of style, and there's not much of it left around here that isn't already locked up under a lease." She had not told Marcus. She had not told Phil Anders, because there was no use paying him to be curious about something that was not technically his business yet. She had simply signed the papers, taken her 4 worthless acres, and driven home with the radio off, doing arithmetic in her head the entire way that she had no intention of showing anyone the sum of. The first 6 weeks after the divorce were the hardest of Carol's adult life, and she would have told you, if you asked, that this had less to do with losing Marcus and more to do with losing the only identity Merrow had ever assigned her. She had moved into a rented 2-bedroom on Linden Street with $4,200 in a checking account that was hers alone for the first time in 19 years, and she had spent the first 2 of those weeks doing the kind of nothing that looks, from the outside, like grief, and feels, from the inside, like waiting for a verdict that has already been handed down. She was 43 years old and had not bought groceries for one person since she was 23. She stood in the cereal aisle of the Hy-Vee on a Wednesday and could not, for almost a full minute, remember whether she liked Raisin Bran or had simply bought it for 19 years because Marcus did. Her hip had started aching the previous spring. Nothing dramatic. Nothing a doctor in Marrow had been able to name beyond early wear, keep moving, ice it if it's bad, and the cold snap in late October made it worse. She did not mention it to anyone. She had learned a long time ago, stacking feed bags 6 days a week since she was 24, that the body simply collected the cost of work eventually, and that the collecting did not stop because the marriage had. She had not spoken to her younger sister Denise in 4 years, not because of any single fight, but because of an accumulation of small ones, the kind that calcify into silence without anyone quite agreeing to it. Denise had not approved of Marcus from the start, and had said so once at a Thanksgiving in 2014, and Carol had not forgiven the saying so even after she had come, privately, to agree with it. She thought about calling Denise more than once during those 6 weeks. She did not. She had also stopped, somewhere in the last decade of the marriage, doing the kind of work her hands actually remembered how to do. She had grown up canning with her grandmother every August. Tomatoes, green beans, a kind of dilly bean recipe nobody else in the family had ever bothered to learn. And she had not put up a single jar since the year she married Marcus, because Marcus considered canning something your grandmother did, and had said so often enough that Carol had simply let the habit go, the way you let go of things that keep getting mocked gently enough that fighting about them feels disproportionate. She found her grandmother's canning jars in a box in the garage of the rental house on Linden Street the second week after she moved in, still wrapped in newspaper from some move 20 years earlier, and she did not unpack them that week. She looked at them for a long time and put the box back on the shelf. It was on the 4th Saturday of that stretch, the 3rd week of October, that Carol drove out to her grandfather's land for the first time since the papers were signed, with a tape measure, a notebook, and a folding aluminum chair from the garage of the rental house, and parked at the gate Earl Whitfield had built in 1968. The gate was metal, gone soft brown with rust, the chain still wrapped twice around the post the way Earl had left it the last autumn before his hands stopped working. The hinges had not moved in years. Carol had to lift the whole gate off its sag to get it open, and the effort of it, 43 years old, hip aching in the cold, hauling iron that her grandfather had once swung open with one hand, was the first thing that made her laugh out loud in 6 weeks. It was not a happy laugh. It was closer to recognition. The collapsed equipment shed sat 50 feet in from the road, its tin roof folded in on itself like a closed hand. Swallows nesting in what remained of the eaves, their droppings whitening the rusted purlins in long, uneven streaks. The grass was waist-high and going gold the way Nebraska grass does in late October, and underneath it, if you knew exactly where to look, you could still find the old furrow lines from the last time Earl Whitfield had run a plow across the back 2 acres, sometime before 1989. Faint ridges that the frost had never quite let the ground forget. Carol walked the property line for 40 minutes with the tape measure, not because she needed the exact dimensions, the deed had those, but because walking it gave her hands something to do while her mind did the rest of the work. She measured the frontage along Route 9, 312 feet. She measured the depth of the parcel from the road to the back fence line, where Earl's land met the Crenshaw place, 558 feet. 4 acres, almost exactly, the way the deed said. Though deeds and ground never quite agree, and Carol had wanted to feel it for herself. The fence along the western edge had fallen in 3 places. The cedar posts rotted through at the ground line, and she made a note of that too, though she did not yet know whether she would ever need it fixed. The equipment shed was a ruin in every direction she looked at it. The roof had come down at the north end first, probably a windstorm sometime in the last decade, and the rest had followed under its own collapsed weight, the way these old steel frame structures do once one purlin lets go. The smell inside was rust and old motor oil and something faintly sweet underneath it. Decades of spilled grain meal that had never fully washed out of the dirt floor. Sparrows had built in the eave gaps where the swallows hadn't claimed territory first, and the whole structure ticked faintly in the wind, metal expanding and contracting the way old steel does even in cold weather. Carol stepped carefully over a section of fallen purlin gone soft with rust, the metal flaking orange onto the toe of her boot, and found, half buried in dirt and old straw, a galvanized feed scoop her grandfather had used, the handle worn smooth in the exact place a hand would rest, the kind of wear that only comes from thousands of repetitions across years, not weeks. Inside, where the roof had not fully caved, she found the remains of her grandfather's last working tractor parts, a transmission housing, rusted solid, that he had never gotten around to selling for scrap, and a wooden tool chest, swollen and split from 40 years of rain getting in through gaps in the siding, the lid hanging by one hinge. She did not open it that day. She made a note in her notebook instead. Tool chest, any corner, check later. She had learned, watching her grandfather work a field for the first 11 years of her life, that you inventoried before you decided what to keep. She cataloged, in that same notebook, 6 items worth a second look: the feed scoop, the transmission housing, the tool chest, a coil of rusted but intact fence wire, a wooden-handled post driver leaning in the corner that still had useful life in it, and a stack of cedar fence posts. Gray with age but solid at the core when she tested one with her thumbnail. She sat down in the folding chair in the middle of the 4 acres and ate a sandwich she had packed that morning. Turkey on white bread the way her grandmother used to make it, and for the first time since the divorce, nobody told her what the land was worth. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like static. A red-tailed hawk worked the thermals over the Crenshaw place a quarter-mile off. Carol Whitfield sat on her grandfather's ground, ate her sandwich, and let herself, for 20 minutes, simply be a woman sitting on land that belonged to her and to no one else. The first thing in 19 years that had ever been entirely and only hers. She came back the following Saturday with a crowbar and got the tool chest open. Most of what was inside had gone to rust and rot, hand tools warped beyond use, a coffee can of bolts fused into a single solid mass. But in the bottom, wrapped in a chamois cloth that had somehow kept most of the damp out, she found her grandfather's surveying transit, a brass and steel instrument from sometime in the 1950s. The kind he had used to lay out fence lines and drainage grades by hand before anyone in the county owned a GPS unit. And beneath that, folded twice, a hand-drawn plat map of the parcel in Earl Whitfield's own draftsman's hand, dated 1968, with a note in pencil along the eastern boundary that read, in handwriting Carol would have recognized anywhere, "Gravel here. Pa always said so. Don't sell cheap." Carol sat very still in the ruined shed for several minutes, holding a piece of paper her grandfather had written 56 years before anyone else had thought to look. Russ Okafor came back out to the property the following Tuesday, this time with a soil auger and a clipboard. And Carol watched him work the way she had once watched her grandfather work, not asking questions, letting the silence do what silence does. Russ was 51, divorced himself, with a particular squint of a man who had spent 30 years reading core samples and could tell river sand from pit sand at 40 feet. He had spent 26 of those years working for a regional engineering firm out of Kearney before going independent, and he had a reputation, among the handful of farmers and small landowners who knew to call him for telling people the truth about their ground, even when the truth was disappointing. He had fixed the walk-in cooler at Delgado's 2 winters earlier and refused payment because Carol had given his daughter a job stocking shelves the summer the family had needed the income. "You want the long version, or the short version?" Russ said, pulling the auger up out of the ground and tapping pale sand out into his palm. "Short version. I've got a job interview at the John Deere dealership in an hour I'm not even sure I want." Short version is your grandfather's 4 acres sit on top of roughly 11 feet of commercial-grade sand and gravel aggregate. And there's a company out of Grand Island, Schaffer Aggregate, that's been quietly buying up mineral rights within 6 miles of here for the last 2 years, because the county's about to repave 40 miles of Route 9 and the interstate spur, and they need fill material that doesn't have to truck in from 200 miles away. He closed his hand around the sand and let it run back out between his fingers, fine pale grains catching briefly in the October light. Long version is the same thing, except I tell you the part where I almost didn't say anything because I figured it wasn't my business, and then I decided it was, because of what you did for my daughter, and that's not a thing I forget. Carol showed him the plat map from the tool chest. Russ studied Earl Whitfield's pencil note for a long moment. "Gravel here. Pa always said so. Don't sell cheap," and exhaled through his nose, something between a laugh and a kind of respect he did not often extend to dead men he'd never met. "Your grandfather knew this in 1968, he said. 56 years, and nobody since has bothered to check." "How much?" Carol said. "I'm not a real estate lawyer, but I know what Schaffer paid for the Munson place 2 sections over, and that was 9 acres with worse road access than this. They paid $340,000 for the mineral lease alone, 20-year term. Surface rights stayed with the family." Russ wiped his hand on his jeans. "You've got better frontage than the Munsons did, and you own this outright, free and clear, which I am guessing, given that look on your face, is a fairly recent development." 6 weeks, Carol said. Russ Okafor did not ask the question sitting right there in his mouth. He simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he has decided he does not need the rest of a story to know what kind of story it is. She drove home that afternoon and turned down the John Deere interview the following morning, a decision that would have terrified her 4 months earlier, and that now felt, instead, like the first decision in 19 years she had made entirely for her own reasons. She had $4,200 in a checking account, 4 acres of mineral rights worth more than her ex-husband's entire feed store, and a grandfather's handwriting telling her not to sell cheap. She sat in her truck in the John Deere dealership parking lot for several minutes after the interview ended, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to feel, fully and without rushing past it, what it was like to walk away from a safe thing, because she finally had a reason not to need it. She did not call Schaffer Aggregate that week. She called the Larson family instead, who ran the only other hardware operation within 30 miles, over in Custer City, and asked Donna Larson, who she had known since high school and had not spoken to in 4 years because Marcus had never liked the Larsons, whether Donna would consider a partnership on a second location. Carol had run Delgado Feed and Hardware's books for 19 years. She knew the margins on every category in that store down to the percentage point. She knew, with a clarity that had nothing bitter in it and everything practical, that Marcus alone, without her doing the ordering, the inventory, the supplier relationships, had exactly the skill set required to stand around being likable and nothing else. She did not tell Donna Larson about the gravel. What she told Donna was that she had 4 acres with excellent frontage on Route 9, half a mile closer to the interstate spur than anything currently zoned commercial in the county. and that if Donna wanted to talk about a feed and supply outpost that could undercut Marcus Delgado on every bulk order within a 40-mile radius, she should come look at the land before the snow came. Donna Larson drove out the following Tuesday and stood at the rusted gate in a denim jacket with her hands in her pockets. "Carol, this is scrub. It's scrub on top," Carol said. "Walk the back half with me." They walked the property line together, Carol pointing out the frontage measurements, the access points off Route 9, the elevation that kept the front half-acre well, drained even in spring runoff. Details she had only learned herself in the last 6 weeks, but delivered with the flat confidence of someone who had been carrying them for years. Donna, for her part, kept circling back to the same question in different forms. Why now? Why this land? Why a woman 6 weeks out of a divorce was suddenly talking about commercial frontage instead of simply trying to get through the winter? "Because I've spent 19 years being the reason somebody else's business worked," Carol told her finally, standing at the edge of the collapsed shed with the wind picking up. "I'd like to find out what happens when it's mine." Donna didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus never had the first idea what he had, did he? And it was not really a question." And Carol did not answer it as one. If you've made it this far into Carol Whitfield's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. They did not discuss the gravel that day, or the next. Carol was not ready to discuss it with anyone who did not already know, not because she distrusted Donna, but because she had learned something in the last 2 months that she had apparently needed 43 years to learn. That information was the only asset in this entire ordeal that had ever actually belonged to her, free and clear, the way the land now did. And she intended to spend it carefully. In November, Carol drove to Grand Island herself, alone, and sat across a conference table from 2 chauffeur aggregate engineers and a leasing attorney named Patricia Voss, who had clearly expected from the file to be negotiating with someone less prepared than the woman who walked in with her grandfather's plat map, Russ Okafor's soil samples, and a typed list of every comparable lease Russ had been able to find in 3 surrounding counties. Carol did not raise her voice once in that meeting. She also did not accept the first number chauffeur offered, $280,000 up front. No royalty structure. A 30-year term that would have tied up the mineral rights longer than Carol intended to be alive to watch it pay out. Or the second, $340. 00 with a royalty Russ had flagged beforehand as the number they offer people who don't know to ask for more. "You've done your homework," Patricia Voss said, somewhere around the 3rd hour, in a tone that was not quite a compliment and not quite a complaint, sliding a 3rd revised term sheet across the table. "I've done books for other people's businesses for 19 years, Carol said. "This is the first time I've gotten to do the math for myself." One of the engineers, a younger man named Aaron, who had said almost nothing for 3 hours, finally spoke up. "The Munson lease 2 sections over went for $340,000 flat. No royalty. You're asking for more than that, and a royalty on top." "The Munson place had worse frontage and a longer haul road to the spur," Carol said. "Mine doesn't. I'm not asking you to pay me for land I don't have. I'm asking you to pay me for the land I do have." She had practiced that sentence in her truck in the parking lot before walking in, the way she used to practice a price increase before delivering it to a supplier rep at Delgado's, and it landed exactly the way she'd hoped it would. Flat, unbothered, impossible to argue with because it wasn't an opinion. Patricia Voss looked at the engineers, and the engineers looked at the topographical survey Russ had helped Carol annotate, and somewhere in the 4th hour the number on the table became $415,000 up front. A 22-year term instead of 30. a per-ton royalty on every load extracted, and surface rights to the front half-acre carved out entirely for Carol's own use, a clause Patricia Voss had not offered until Carol asked for it directly, twice, the second time without blinking. She left Grand Island with a signed letter of intent, a 22-year mineral lease at $415,000 up front, plus a per-ton royalty on every load of aggregate extracted over the life of the lease, with surface rights to the front half-acre carved out entirely for her own use. Russ Okafor, when she called him from the parking lot, was quiet for a second, and then said, "That's the high end of fair, Carol. That's somebody who's been doing math for other people for 19 years and finally got to do it for herself." She put $90,000 of the upfront lease payment into a building, not on the gravel acreage itself. Schoffer's engineers wanted that section cleared and graded for access roads by the following spring, but on the front half-acre along Route 9, exactly where her grandfather's equipment shed had stood since before she was born. She had the shed torn down in late November. She stood at the edge of the property and watched an excavator take down the tin roof that had sheltered swallows for 6 years, the metal folding and tearing with a sound like something clearing its throat. And she did not feel sad about it, because she had already decided what was going up in its place. She hired a contractor named Doug Petrick, a man who had built 3 pole barns for farmers in the county and had no interest whatsoever in anyone's divorce. And together, over a card table in her rented kitchen, they drew up plans for a 40 by 60 steel building with a 12-foot eave height, a loading dock on the south wall to take advantage of the prevailing wind, and a gravel apron graded to drain away from the foundation rather than toward it, a detail Doug mentioned in passing, and Carol corrected him on, gently, because she had watched her grandfather lose a foundation to standing water once, and had never forgotten the lesson. Doug looked at her for a second longer than the comment required. "You've built before," he said. "I've watched someone build for 11 years of my childhood," Carol said. "Same thing, mostly, if you're paying attention." Construction started the first week of December, in 19-degree weather that made the crew's breath hang in front of them like something solid. Carol came out most mornings before opening her register shift at a feed store in Custer City she'd taken part-time work at, just to watch the framing go up. First, the steel posts set in concrete piers, 8 of them along each long wall, sunk 4 feet into ground that hadn't been disturbed since Earl Whitfield's last plow pass. Then the purlins. Then the roof panels going on 1 ribbed sheet at a time, screwed down in a pattern Doug's crew had clearly done 100 times before. Doug ran a level along the first course of wall girts on a Thursday morning and found a 1/4 inch of drift over 20 feet. And rather than shimming it the quick way, he had his crew pull the anchor bolts on 2 piers and reset them, costing the project a day and a half he didn't bill Carol extra for. "Why fix it instead of shimming?" Carol asked him, standing in the cold with a thermos of coffee she'd started bringing for the crew without being asked. "Because in 15 years that 1/4 inch is an inch, and an inch is a roof leak," Doug said. "Same reason your grandfather graded his foundation pad before he ever set a post. I looked at the old footings before we tore the shed down. He knew what he was doing in 1968. I figured I'd match it." By the second week of January, the building had walls, corrugated steel siding, and a deep green Carol had chosen herself off a sample card, rejecting the contractor's standard gray Doug had quoted by default, because she had decided somewhere in November that nothing about this building was going to be the default version of anything. By the first week of February, it had a concrete slab poured inside, cured under insulated blankets against the cold for 6 days before the forms came off, and a set of sliding doors on the loading dock side that Carol tested herself, sliding them open and shut 3 times, just to feel the weight of something that belonged entirely to her move the way she wanted it to move. The electrical went in over 2 weekends in February, run by a Marrow electrician named Hal Brunner, who had wired half the outbuildings in the county, and who installed, at Carol's specific request, a transformer sized for a future cold storage addition she had not yet built, but had already, in her head, designed the footprint for. Most people wire for what they need today, Hal told her, running conduit along a wall stud. You're wiring for 5 years from now. I spent 19 years building things sized for somebody else's idea of today, Carol said. I'm done doing that. She used her grandmother's maiden name for the sign rather than her own married name or even her birth name, because her grandfather, Earl Whitfield, had farmed this exact dirt for over 40 years, and because Carol Delgado had stopped feeling like a name that belonged to her the day Marcus stood in their kitchen and told her she could keep her little farm. The sign painter, a man out of Kearney who did most of the agricultural signage in 3 counties, quoted her $1,800 for a lit, double-sided sign and had it up by the 2nd week of March, Whitfield Feed and Supply. White letters on grain, visible from a quarter mile in either direction on Route 9. She worked the register herself the first 6 weeks the store was open, alongside one part-time employee, a 19-year-old named Tyler Brock, who had worked summers at Delgado's and had quietly asked Carol, the week after she opened, whether she needed help. The opening week brought $4,300 in sales, mostly curious neighbors and 2 wholesale accounts Russ Okafor had personally called to recommend her to. Men who trusted Russ's read on people the way Carol had once trusted her grandfather's read on land. She knew every wholesale supplier rep in the region on a first-name basis already, from 19 years at Marcus's store, and every one of them had quietly preferred working with her the entire time. The orders that arrived correct, the invoices paid on time, the woman who remembered which farms needed delivery before dark because of livestock schedules. 3 of Marcus's longest-standing accounts moved their business to Whitfield Feed and Supply within 90 days of her opening, not because Carol solicited them, but because she had always been the actual reason they kept ordering, and now there was a building with the right name on it. She did the inventory layout herself, the way she'd done it at Delgado's for 19 years, fast movers nearest the door, seed and fertilizer organized by season rather than alphabetically, the bagged feed stacked by weight and turnover rate, so the heaviest, highest volume product never had to travel far from the loading dock. Doug Petrick, helping her hang shelving on a Saturday in April, said it looked like she'd done this before. 22 years, Carol said. Just never on a building with my own name on the deed. Marcus Delgado, through all of this, knew none of it. He was 91 minutes away in Lincoln, in an apartment that smelled like new paint, telling Renee Hutchins that the divorce had gone about as clean as these things go, running a store whose order volume he did not fully understand was dropping, because he had never once, in 19 years, looked closely enough at the supplier relationships to know which ones had only ever depended on a woman he had let walk out the door with her. Little Farm. The grading crew had worked through March, cutting a gravel access road 40 feet wide along the eastern property line, the exact stretch Earl Whitfield had marked on his 1968 plat map in pencil, and Carol had stood at the edge of it one cold afternoon, watching a chauffeur foreman named Glenn Esri check a load weight against a manifest, and had thought that her grandfather, who had drawn that pencil line by hand with a compass and a straightedge 50 6 years earlier, would have found something satisfying in watching the machinery finally catch up to what he'd already known. By May, the back 2 acres, the section chauffeur aggregate, had graded for access roads over the winter. At its first, hauler traffic, a steady rotation of tandem axle dump trucks pulling loaded gravel out toward the Route 9 repaving project 6 miles east. Carol could hear them from the store, a low diesel rumble that started most mornings around 7, and she had come to find the sound almost companionable, the way some people find ocean noise calming. Wendell Ruiz, a farmer 3 sections south who'd bought from Marcus for 11 years before he hadn't, told her once, leaning on the counter while she rang up a 50-pound bag of cracked corn, that he liked hearing the trucks. "Means something's finally happening out here that isn't somebody's funeral," he said, and Carol laughed for real, the kind of laugh that surprised her a little on the way out. She replaced the part-time hours with a second full-time hire in June. A woman named Patty Osweiler, 58, who had worked the counter at a co-op in Custer City for 11 years before it closed, and who Carol hired after exactly one conversation, because Patty had asked the right question in the interview, not about pay, but about how Carol wanted returns handled on damaged feed bags, a detail that told Carol everything she needed to know about whether a person had actually worked a counter before. Patty had been laid off when the co-op consolidated with a larger chain out of Kearney, a decision made by people 3 states away who had never once set foot in the building, and she told Carol on her first day that she had sworn she'd never work retail again unless it was for someone who actually knew what she was looking at when she looked at an invoice. "I know what I'm looking at," Carol told her, and Patty had nodded once, satisfied. And that had been the entire negotiation. It was Patty, in fact, who asked Carol one afternoon in late June, restocking a shelf of fence wire, whether she had any family who'd come see the place yet, and the question sat with Carol longer than Patty probably intended it to. That evening, Carol called her sister Denise for the first time in 4 years, and did not lead with an apology or an explanation, because she had decided somewhere in the previous 8 months that she was done leading with those for things that had mostly been Marcus's doing in the first place. "I built something," Carol said, when Denise picked up. "I'd like you to see it before I tell you what it is." Denise drove up from Lincoln the following weekend. She had moved there 9 years earlier for a job in school administration and had never quite forgiven Marcus for the Thanksgiving she'd said what she'd said. She stood in the gravel lot in front of the building, the Whitfield Feed and Supply sign overhead, and was quiet long enough that Carol started to worry the 4 years of silence had cost more than she'd realized. Denise walked the length of the loading dock, ran a hand along the green steel siding, and looked back toward the road where the rusted gate still stood, unpainted, exactly as Earl Whitfield had left it. "This is Grandpa's land," Denise said finally. "It is. And that's your name on it, not his." She meant Marcus, and they both knew it. "It's our grandmother's name," Carol said. "I figured it had earned the right to be on something again." Denise didn't say much else that day, but she came back 2 weekends later with her own toolbox and helped Carol build out the shelving in the back room, and by August, the two of them were talking on the phone most Sundays, the way they had when they were girls, before husbands and houses and 4 years of a silence that had never really been about either of them. The garden Carol put in behind the rented house on Linden Street that spring was the first thing she had planted in 19 years that Marcus had no opinion about, because Marcus had no idea it existed. She put in tomatoes, 2 rows of green beans, and a stand of sunflowers along the back fence that her grandmother had always grown, and by August the sunflowers stood taller than the fence itself, turning east every morning the way sunflowers do. And Carol found herself thinking, more than once, that this was the first August in 19 years she had not spent waiting to find out what kind of mood Marcus would be in by dinner. In late August, she finally took her grandmother's canning jars down from the garage shelf, unwrapped them from 20-year-old newspaper, washed them in water hot enough to fog the kitchen window, and put up 14 quarts of green beans and 9 of her grandmother's dilly beans, following a recipe she had not needed to write down, because her hands remembered it, without her mind's help. She gave 3 jars to Patty, 2 to Russ, and kept the rest on a shelf in the back room of Whitfield Feed and Supply, where customers occasionally asked about them, and Carol occasionally told them the truth, that her grandmother had taught her, and her husband had thought it was something only grandmothers did, and her grandmother, it turned out, had been right about more things than anyone in the family had given her credit for. Her hip bothered her less by midsummer, not because it had healed. The doctor in Marrow had been honest that it likely never fully would, but because she had stopped sitting still long enough to feel it the way she used to. She moved differently now, Doug Petrick told her once, watching her cross the gravel lot toward the loading dock. More like somebody who decided where she was going, he said. Carol didn't entirely know what he meant by that, but she knew enough not to ask him to explain it. In September, almost exactly 1 year after the divorce was finalized, Carol drove out to her grandfather's land on a Saturday morning, the way she had that first October, except this time she did not need a tape measure or a folding chair. The building stood where the equipment shed had collapsed. The sign was lit even in daylight, a habit the electrician had set and Carol had never bothered to change. 3 trucks sat in the gravel lot, customers inside buying seed corn ahead of the fall planting season, and behind the building, the access road Schoffer had graded carried its steady rotation of haulers out toward the highway project, 6 miles east, on schedule and on budget. Exactly the way Patricia Voss's engineers had promised it would be. Carol stood at the rusted gate her grandfather had built in 1968. She had kept it, repaired but unpainted, as the entrance to the gravel lot rather than tear it out, and thought, for the first time in longer than she could comfortably count, that she had built something with her own decisions instead of simply surviving someone else's. The following Saturday, the first weekend of October, Russ Okafor drove out with his daughter, now 22, and working her first job out of college, just to see the building finished. Doug Petrick stopped by on his way to another job to check the slab for cracking, found none, and stayed for coffee anyway. Donna Larson came up from Custer City with a box of her own store's seed catalogs, the two of them having settled by then into something closer to friendly competitors than the partnership Carol had first floated. Donna had decided her own location made more sense than splitting one, and Carol had agreed, because she had learned, building this, that she preferred a business with only one name on the deed. Patty Osweiler brought a casserole, the way Patty brought a casserole to almost everything, and Tyler Brock's mother came by to thank Carol for giving her son something to do that wasn't trouble, which made Carol laugh, because 19-year-old Tyler had never once given anyone trouble that Carol had seen. Denise drove up from Lincoln for the afternoon too, and stood with Carol at the edge of the gravel lot while the others talked, watching the last of the year's haulers finish their run toward the highway project. Grandpa would have liked this, Denise said. He's the one who told us not to sell cheap, Carol said. 56 years before anybody needed to hear it. It was a small gathering, 6 people and a casserole dish, on a half-acre that 11 months earlier had been a collapsed shed nobody had looked at twice in over a decade. Carol stood in the middle of it and thought that this, 6 people who had each, in their own way, decided she was worth showing up for, was its own kind of return on an investment nobody had thought to value. Marcus Delgado, in that same stretch of months, was losing a business he did not yet understand he was losing. Don Caswell's office had filed the divorce settlement in February, and by October, Delgado Feed and Hardware's wholesale order volume had dropped 31% year over year. A number, Marcus's bookkeeper, a woman named Sheila Pruitt, hired 6 months after Carol left, who lasted 4 months before quitting, had flagged to him twice in writing without ever quite getting a response that suggested he understood what she was telling him. What had happened, in plain terms, was that Carol had never simply run the books at Delgado's. She had been the actual interface between the store and every supplier relationship that mattered. The woman who called ahead about delivery timing, who caught a pricing error before it became a $4,000 mistake, who remembered that the Crenshaws needed feed delivered before 4 because of their milking schedule, and the Ruises needed it after 6 because Wendell worked another job until 5. Marcus had never learned any of that in 19 years because he had never needed to. Now he needed to, and discovered across a slow and humiliating 10 months that he did not know how. He raised prices that autumn to cover the shortfall, a decision Sheila Pruitt advised against in a memo Marcus never read past the first line of. And the price increase drove 2 more long-standing accounts to Whitfield Feed and Supply within 3 weeks, though Marcus did not yet know where they had gone, only that they were gone. He had heard, vaguely, second-hand, from a supplier rep named Kurt Jansen, that Carol's got some kind of operation going on out by her grandpa's old place, and had not thought much of it, because the version of Carol that existed in Marcus's head, the one he had built a settlement around, was not a woman capable of running an operation. That version of Carol had never been accurate. It had simply never been tested against anything Marcus was paying close enough attention to notice. It was the second week of December, 11 months after the divorce was finalized, when Marcus Delgado drove out Route 9 to check a delivery address for a wholesale customer whose account had quietly stopped responding to his calls. Kurt Jansen's largest farm account, as it happened. The one Kurt had mentioned only in passing, and saw the steel building standing where the equipment shed used to be. He pulled his truck onto the gravel lot without signaling, the tires kicking up a spray of fine aggregate dust that had come, though he did not know it yet, from the very acreage behind the building he was staring at. He sat in the cab for almost a full minute before he got out, looking at the sign lit white against the gray December sky, at the loading dock, at the rows of bagged feed stacked under the overhang exactly the way Carol used to stack it at his own store, by weight and turnover rate, the fast movers closest to the door. Carol was at the counter when he came in, wearing a canvas jacket with Whitfield Feed and Supply stitched over the breast pocket, ringing up a 50-pound bag of cracked corn for Wendell Ruiz, who farmed 3 sections south and had been buying from Marcus for 11 years before he hadn't. Marcus stood just inside the door and did not say anything for several seconds. His eyes moved across the shelving, the inventory layout, the clipboard of supplier invoices hanging by the register, 3 of which carried account numbers he would have recognized from his own dwindling order sheets if he'd looked closely enough, which he hadn't, in 19 years, ever quite needed to. He noticed the green steel siding, a color he would have called too expensive if anyone had asked his opinion, which no one had. He noticed the transformer box on the back wall, oversized for the building it served, though he had no way of knowing why, or that Hal Brunner had sized it for an addition that did not exist yet. "This is your land," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "It's my grandfather's land," Carol said, handing Wendell his change. "Has been since 1968. This is the junk lot." "It was never junk," Carol said. "It just wasn't valuable to anybody who didn't bother looking under the grass." Marcus looked past her, out the window, at the loading dock, at the gravel hauler pulling out from the access road behind the building, the one running its steady rotation toward the Route 9 repaving project 6 miles east. A project that, by then, was common knowledge in 3 counties. And a contract Don Caswell, his own divorce attorney, had apparently never thought to mention might apply to 4 acres he'd helped Marcus describe as negligible in a court filing 11 months earlier. Marcus's hand came up and rested on the doorframe, not quite gripping it, the way a man's hand finds something solid when the rest of him has stopped being sure of anything. "That's the gravel project," Marcus said. You've got the mineral lease." "I do. For how much?" Carol finished counting the till drawer before she answered him, because she had learned in 19 years that some silences were worth more than any sentence she could put inside them. "Enough," she said. Marcus's jaw worked once, the particular motion of a man doing arithmetic he very badly did not want to be doing in front of a customer. Wendell Ruiz, to his credit, found something extremely interesting to look at on the seed display and did not turn around. "You let me think it was worthless," Marcus said. "You told me it was worthless," Carol said. "Twice, in 19 years. I never once corrected you. I didn't think it was my job to do your homework for you, Marcus. I never did, really, even when I was doing your actual homework. Every single day for 19 years. Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it again. There was a beat where he seemed to be reaching for the line he usually reached for, the one about being practical, about somebody having to be the adult about the assets, and finding, for what may have been the first time in his life, that the line had nowhere left to land. He did not have anything to say to that. He looked around the store one more time, at the shelves stocked the way she had always stocked them, at the building with the right name on the deed standing on the dirt he had once told a lawyer was worth less than $2,000, and then he turned and walked back out to his truck. He sat in the cab for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the sign one more time through the windshield. And then he pulled out of the gravel lot, the same fine aggregate dust kicking up behind his tires that had kicked up when he arrived, except now he understood, in a way he hadn't an hour earlier, exactly where it had come from. He did not come back. Wendell Ruiz waited until Marcus's truck had cleared the gate before he finally turned around from the seed display. "That was a long way to drive to find out you sold your own gravel rights for free," he said. "He didn't sell them," Carol said, ringing up the next sale in line. "He just never bothered to check what he was giving away. There's a difference, even if it comes out to the same number." Wendell considered that for a second, the way a man considers something he is going to repeat to somebody else later. "Your grandfather would have liked that one," he said, and left it there, and Carol let him. Carol Whitfield closed the store at 6 that evening. Same as always, counted the drawer, $2,340 for the day. A Tuesday in December, better than most Tuesdays had any right to be, and walked out to the gravel lot her grandfather had once parked a tractor on. The December air was 19 degrees and clean, and the steel building behind her threw a long rectangle of light out across the lot from the 2 fixtures Doug Petrick had mounted over the loading dock. Her breath hung in front of her the way it had that first October morning, hauling the rusted gate open by herself, except her hip did not ache the way it had then. Or she had simply stopped noticing whether it did. Wendell Ruiz's truck was long gone. The last gravel hauler of the day had finished its run, the diesel rumble fading out toward the highway 6 miles east, where the new pavement was already going down, smooth and dark against the old. The sign, Whitfield Feed and Supply, was lit from below by a single ground-mounted floodlight, the letters throwing shadows up across the deep green steel siding and out across the 4 acres her grandfather had told her, 56 years before anyone else thought to check, not to sell cheap. Carol stood for a minute in the cold with her keys in her hand, looking at the building standing exactly where the collapsed shed used to be, at the gate she had repaired but never repainted, at the place where Earl Whitfield's old furrow lines still ran faintly under the gravel apron if you knew to look for them. A truck passed on Route 9, headlights sweeping briefly across the lot, and then it was gone, and the only light left was the floodlight under the sign and the 2 fixtures over the dock, and the cold, clean dark settling in over 4 acres that had outlasted every word anyone had ever used to describe them as worthless. The sign stayed lit all night, the way she'd had the electricians set it from the start, and from the highway, anyone driving past after dark could read every letter.